Oren Harman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Yascha.
So you're writing about subjects which don't immediately touch on politics, but I think are actually interesting to think about from a political perspective. And in a way, you're trying to answer some puzzles about evolution. Why is it that a caterpillar turns into a butterfly when that seems an unnecessarily complicated process from an evolutionary perspective? And why is it in a previous book that many of us are capable of altruism, and many animals are capable of altruism, even though you would think that in an evolutionary process which favors the survival of the fittest, you would end up selecting against that kind of altruism. But why don't we start there? Explain the puzzle to us, first of all. What's so puzzling about altruism?
Right, so Darwin himself recognized the puzzle looking at the social insects, where you have entire castes of bees and termites and ants who, it looks like, forego reproduction altogether in order to sacrificing their lives for their queen. In other words, from a biological point of view, their fitness is zero. They don't reproduce. They're negligible from an evolutionary point of view. And that just seems like it doesn't make sense if evolution is a game of survival of the fittest. Why would a characteristic that reduces fitness evolve over time? And so Darwin wrote, if I cannot find a good solution to this problem, my entire theory is worthless. And
So he really was this bothered him. It wasn't just an
yeah,
interesting little puzzle. He felt that this is a challenge to the core of his scientific worldview.
for sure. And his answer was that it's for the good of the community, what we would today call group selection. But for many years in the 20th century, group selection was considered very fuzzy thinking, bad science, because when you think of a group, two groups, say, competing with one another. So, what would be your guess? Which group would be stronger in this competition? A group full of altruists or a group full of egoists?
Right, you would guess that it's a group full of egoists.
Well, so you would guess that it's a group full of altruists because they're all cooperating with one another.
Oh, right, yeah.
Egoists would be every man for himself. The altruists come together.
But within the group, it's the egoists that would
Exactly.
win.
So within the group, if you're a selfish person, then when everyone runs ahead to fight the enemy, you take a step back and you live to tell the story the next day. And if this characteristic is inherent in you, if it's a trait which you can pass on biologically, then over time you will see that there's a problem of stability for the altruistic group.
The standard example of this that I remember, I think, from Jonathan Haidt's really interesting book, The Righteous Mind, in which he has a chapter on group level selection, is that we might say, oh, look at that herd of fast. Sorry, we might say, look at that fast herd of gazelles over there, and the objection of the people who are skeptical about group level selection is to say it's not a fast herd of gazelles. It's a gazelle. It's not a fast herd of gazelles. It's a herd of fast gazelles, because what happens is not that an entire group of gazelles is wiped out by a lion and some other entire group of gazelles survives. It's that each time the slowest gazelle gets eaten. And so over time, the gazelles become faster because those are the ones that survive and are able to pass on their genetics. But what looks like group level selection, that the fast herd is going to survive and the slow herd doesn't survive, actually is individual level selection. Each time what happens is not that a lion eats all of the gazelles, they each time eat the slowest gazelle. So,
Right.
so what is the response to that?
So for Darwin, marshalling sort of a Victorian morality, it was uncomplicated. This was for the good of the community, he called it. But later on, we became aware of the problem, the logical problem in this explanation. And ever since Darwin and until this very day, scientists of different stripe, which would mean, mathematical population geneticists and evolutionary psychologists, but also economists and different thinkers have been trying to approach this problem with different tools. Um, the book that I wrote, The Price of Altruism, is about a man by the name of George Price, who wrote a mathematical equation in the early 70s, which was a very sort of deep treatment of the dynamic of natural selection, and it helped to explain the evolution of traits which, like in the case of altruism, are traits where there's a kind of conflict between the different levels of the biological hierarchy, a conflict between the individual and the group, or between the individual and the genes within the individual. And he wrote that equation, and then became an evangelical Christian because of his philosophical interpretation of the meaning of the equation. What it meant to him philosophically was that true altruism, true selflessness doesn't really exist in the world. That there's always, scratch an altruist and watch an egoist bleed. And once a Christian, this was a terrible realization for him, because Christianity was all about sacrifice and so forth. And so he ended up killing himself in a squat in London in 1975. And he was a forgotten figure, but also a really great genius. And that book was about him, using him to tell the grander story of where kindness comes from.
So what is the response to some of those sort of straightforward arguments that smart undergrads can make in a philosophy class about why there's not really such a thing as altruism, right? So one kind of argument would be, really we're just driven by our utility function. And, if you, perhaps that utility function isn't super narrow, it's not just about how many dollars are on your bank account. But, when I do a favor to my friend, it is either because I hope that they're going to reciprocate in some kind of way, or it's because perhaps it gives me pleasure that my friend is helped in some kind of way. But even then, what is driving me is still just my pleasure, right? It so happens that it gives me pleasure to look after my dog and see my dog run around happily or something like that.
Yeah.
Right?
So an argument that you can make against these type of ideas is to say that we are deeply social creatures, and it was crucial for our survival that we be able to cooperate with one another, to stand one another. Just in the first instance, to be able to live amongst one another without killing each other. That was crucial. And then gradually over time, we developed the biological substrates at the genetic and neurological and anatomical level that allowed us not only to live with one another, not only to cooperate beneficially with one another, but also to genuinely empathize with one another. That's baked into our biology. Now, what's interesting about us is that both things exist at the same time. And so it's often up to the external conditions which trait manifests more strongly. And of course to education and culture. And so the blessing of being a human being is that we have this double nature to us, the blessing and the curse. And it's up to us, in a way, to both create the conditions that allow the more empathetic, the more sympathetic, the cooperative, and so forth, the sacrificial, to manifest, as opposed to the egotistical and the self-serving. That's up to us to create those conditions and to teach ourselves to be better. It won't happen on its own. The conditions need to be there.
So I'm trying to think how that operates and how that operates in different kinds of animals, right? So presumably the bee that is sacrificing itself for the queen bee is not really acting rationally, right? They have some kind of, they're not making conscious choices about whether or not to sacrifice themselves in that way.
It's instinctual. Right.
It's instinctual. They're following some kind of biological program.
Right.
Would you say that there's something similar in human beings? That there's certain kinds of ways in which if we see somebody attacking someone in public, and some people are cowardly and don't do anything, but some humans will stand up and protect that person, that is an instinctual response that somehow overrides what would be in our rational self-interest in a way that's parallel to the bee that's sacrificing itself in that situation.
So there are studies that show that a certain percentage of humans act instinctually in ways that are not rational, as you called it. In other words, you see someone fall into the train tracks and you jump after them. And that percentage seems to be quite robust. It's about 10% of people will do that. And so, of course, it's been very interesting to scientists to understand, to look at the biology, to look at these people more closely. What is it that makes them such, amazing altruists? And the jury is still out. There are many attempts to reify and reduce complex behaviors to simple biological answers. Let's find it in their genes. Let's find it in their brains. So so there are studies at Stanford, for instance. There's a study for a Center for the Study of human well-being and kindness, or something like that was funded initially by the Dalai Lama. And they take Buddhist monks, they put them in fMRIs, and they tried to see whether they're different, their brains function differently, and so on and so forth. So there are those attempts in science. I feel that they will always, in some sense, come up short. Because I feel that the biological leash is long enough it's not short enough to explain all of our behavior instinctually, but clearly we have that instinct within us, and some exercise it in a way which we are amazed by.
I was happy to see in one recent such study that when dogs see their owners, the region that corresponds to some feeling of happiness or endorphins or whatever lights up very strongly, and that seems to be independent on whether or not they're giving a treat. So even if loving the owners may well be an evolutionary strategy at some level, at the level of experience, it doesn't seem to be instrumental in that kind of way.
There is a genuine, we call it in human terms, kindness or empathy, an ability to love one another. That's genuinely in us. And George Price, who killed himself after writing this, amazing equation, which brings us further in understanding, in formal terms, the evolution of a trait like altruism, he was wrong in philosophically interpreting his equation as meaning that there really is no true selflessness in humans. He was wrong.
It seems like there's two different levels of thinking about this, right? Like, one is what motivates us and what is our experience of the world, and the other is why is it that evolution created us such that we are motivated in this kind of way? And It seems to me that whether we're talking about a dog that generally loves its owner, or we're talking about humans who have genuine love and empathy for their family and friends and partners, or simply for somebody on the street who's getting assaulted or something like that, they, I think, have this kind of genuine empathy. Most of them, but maybe somebody who's just hoping to get some reward, or who's a sociopath trying to pass, through social life. But that's not true of most human beings who act altruistically in that kind of way. And then there's the second kind of question of, well, why is it that evolution has led to human beings who are capable of that kind of empathy and of that kind of altruism? And that's a question at a rather different level, right?
Right. And I think that we suffer from a bias of originalism. We think that if we can understand the origin of a certain trait, then we've understood that trait entirely. Which is not the case. There's a difference between why a trait has evolved, why it was selected in the first place, and then what happens with it once it becomes an ingrained capability.
And that's a mistake that we often make in politics nowadays. I mean, it's been labeled for a long time, the genetic fallacy, the idea that if you can show that something has, as we would probably today say, problematic origins, then it must be bad today. But that often doesn't follow. Perhaps the old age pension scheme in Germany has problematic origins as an attempt for Bismarck to keep down the demands of the working class and to stave off socialist revolution. To conclude from that therefore you should be normatively opposed to the old age pension scheme in Germany today would just be a category mistake. But let's get back to that second level of a question then, right? If it's obvious that we can have genuine altruism, we can have genuine empathy, we can have genuine fellow feelings, the question still is, why is it that evolution selected for that? If the fast herd of gazelles is actually just a herd of fast gazelles, and that seems to show that, cases of what look like group level selection turn out to be individual level selection, then how do you get the bee that is not individual level selected, that has zero chance of passing on their own genes? Why is it that people sometimes sacrifice themselves for strangers with whom they don't necessarily share a lot of genetic material? Wouldn't the people who do that end up being selected out? These are 10% of people are the kinds that are going to jump on the train tracks and rescue somebody when the train is oncoming. Well, aren't they going to keep reducing as a share of the human population because they have a higher likelihood of being hit by a train before they have kids? And if that's the case, then aren't they eventually going to die out?
Well, that's probably why their level is down to where it is, about 10%. But that's a kind of equilibrium because they end up being crucial for the cohesion of the group. It's crucial that you have such people who are able to exercise almost instinctually, what looks like almost instinctually, a care for others, which transgresses, politics and culture and so forth. So the answer is no. These are the dynamics of group selection in our case, together with mixed.
But tell me what that means. Does that mean that if the level of altruists let's say that there's sociopaths who are not altruistic in any kind of way, and then there's garden variety altruists that have all kinds of altruistic behaviors, etc., but are not exceptional altruists, and then let's call this group the super altruists, right? And is your contention that when the level of super altruists falls below 10%, this has such adverse effects on the group that a group which contains so few of them will then be outcompeted by other groups that have more of them? So even as at the individual level, you're selecting against the altruists, at the group level, you are selecting for having at least that 1 in 10 share of altruists, and that's why that's the equilibrium?
Right. Exactly. So there are studies that point in that direction. But as you said, the sociopath, one of the traits of a sociopath is that he or she don't blush. Now, what does that tell you? Blushing was a sort of signal that in a social species, evolving as a social species, you are signaling to the other that you have internalized the norms of the group. And that's why you blush, because you understand that you're doing something wrong. The sociopath doesn't blush. So we have all of these sort of ingrained biological mechanisms that whose evolutionary rationale is to signal to the other, you can deal with me. I am someone that you can deal with. I am friendly in some sense. And so all of us have that. Some of us have been able to sort of, if you think of it sort of like as a kernel with ripples that are rippling out successively, then some of us, for whatever reason, and there is biological variation in the population when it comes to these traits, but it's not just biology, as we said, with the myth of originalism. But some of us, stay close to the core. In other words, we look out for ourselves more. And some of us have been able to sort of, have this ripple go out and extend from us outward in ways that reach also something which has been called pathological altruism, where, you give like crazy. I mean, George Price, what happened with him is when he perceived this equation to be sort of a terrible realization, what he did was he said, I will show with my own actions in my own life that I can transcend this miraculous mathematics, go out to the streets of London and become a radical altruist, which is what he did. And he gave away everything. He started by, giving £1 or £2, then buying sandwiches, then helping these people on the streets with their woes, with the law and the police representing them in courts of law and inviting them into his one-bedroom apartment until he had nothing. He literally gave away everything and became a homeless man on the streets of London himself, which is where he killed himself in a squat in 1975. So you have all the gamut, as with most complex behavioral traits. There's variation across the gamut, and it's good that we have certain, that we have that variation. Variation is the lifeblood of evolution.
So tell us more about this pathological level of altruism. I mean, presumably we have sort of garden variety altruism, which seems well adapted. Then we have that 10% of people that we would probably call heroes and admire, right? The willingness to go risk your life to save a stranger from an oncoming subway car is something that, under many circumstances, we think is a positive trait. Now, if it's obvious you're not going to save the stranger and it's obvious you're going to die in the process, then perhaps it would be smarter to stand out on the platform. But in many of those circumstances, the chance of saving the stranger is much higher than the chance of you yourself coming to harm. But it takes courage and it takes altruism. And so when people do that, that's something that is admirable and in some ways rational. It's not rational in the narrowest definition of it. It's not maximizing your self-interest in some kind of very narrow economistic way. But it is something that it doesn't seem like a kind of crazy Don Quixote-style caper where you're doing something that seems obviously ill-advised, even though it might at some level be admirable. When do we cross the boundary into this form of?
That's a normative question. It's down to what we define as pathological. So, for instance, in my culture, there are groups within the culture that have, I think, for cultural reasons, and religious reasons, they have become radical donors of kidneys, for instance, and lungs. And it's a sort of trend which spread like wildfire in the population. This is a population of settlers, interestingly enough. And when that was satiated to some degree, then women began giving their wombs to other women who couldn't have babies. Now, who's to say whether this is pathological or not? It's clearly a trend. It's clearly driven by cultural considerations. It has to do with identity, with the way a particular group defines itself as opposed to other groups. And the question of pathology is a question that we determine in our cultural wars and our cultural evolutions, and so that will be something that changes over time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, but I think this is where the distinction between an in-group and an out-group comes in. At least my mental model of the world has come to be, wasn't always like this, that we're sort of hardwired to have some amount of altruism and courage in dealings with the in-group. That when we have a strongly defined in-group, that is often when we become capable of sacrificing ourselves, as humans have done for many centuries and millennia in war under certain circumstances, but also for doing these genuinely altruistic acts, like giving up a kidney for somebody in our community who may not even be a sibling, may not even be a cousin, maybe somebody to whom we're not related with, who we think of as part of our in-group. I mean, interestingly, that can go hand in hand with very cruel treatment of the out-group, right? The same person
It's not only that it can go hand in hand, but that necessarily in evolutionary time, these were requisites of one another. In other words, the reason group selection works is that it leads to a cohesion of a group, so that group can smite the external group. That's what its initial cause and rationale was, in selective terms. Again, this doesn't mean that we need to strap ourselves to this rationale and have it be true for till the end of time. This is where it began. In fact, without the enemy, the external enemy, the outgroup, then you could not develop these internal mechanisms for group cohesion within, which were so strong that they became really genuine. They really ingrained themselves in our biology. And what's beautiful about the evolution of culture over history is that we've been able to use these characteristics that are embedded within us. They were embedded for reasons that today we might look at as, quite vicious and violent, and use them in order to extend our degrees of empathy to outgroup and so forth. And, to some degree, the types of challenges that we face as a species on planet Earth will require us to extend these degrees of empathy so that we can come together and solve challenges like when a pandemic comes our way and so forth. We need to be able to not to see the political borders that divide us, and rather to see our common humanity in order to fell such a scourge.
Yeah, and I think that's what's interesting about this charge that, in a particular case, altruism has become exaggerated, has become misguided. It can apply to the individual case like Price, where it's, you are no longer keeping even the basic possessions you need in order to have a decent life yourself. And, that may ultimately result in you being so destitute and so desperate that you commit suicide and are no longer able to help others, right? And so that seems sort of self-undermining, and sort of, even in a kind of Kantian, universal imperative perspective, just seems like an irrational thing to do, because you can't even sustain the level of prosperity you need in order to keep helping others, right? But more often, I think what is meant by that is the claim, whether true or false, whether rational or irrational, that you are not helping your in-group in the right ways. When people say that there's something pathological about your altruism, what they often are saying is, rather than helping your in-group, you're naive about the intentions of the out-group, and you're helping the out-group. And that's, I think, often what that charge is really saying.
Yes, I think that's true. I see it in my own culture today, where, we're fighting a terrible and violent war in Gaza. And Israelis who say, wait a second, there are many innocents who are being killed in Gaza. What the hell is happening here? What are we doing? Sure, we have a real and true and vicious enemy in Hamas, but there are too many innocents who are being killed. They are often branded as traitors from within by nationalists who say, if you show
this is pathological altruism,
This type of empathy is self-sacrificing. If you hold these views, we will not survive. And so, yes, of course, as ever, every form of human behavior can be shown in such a way that it looks as if it's an abuse when it really isn't.
So, what do you think is the right balance between the positive role that a strong in-group can play, the ways in which it can give us belonging and identity and solidarity, the way in which it can ensure that our group survives group-level selection, which is one of the evolutionary mechanisms at play, as you're saying, but at the same time, that it doesn't lead us to lose our humanity in such a way where we start to justify anything that might be done to the outgroup, with the excuse that to care about that would just be, a form of pathological altruism.
Right. Well, I think this is a question that humans, have asked themselves. I mean, think of the pacifists in World War I. There were international pacifists in Germany and in France and in England and so forth who, the moment the shooting began in 1914, had a great dilemma, and some of them, remained idealistic, and others said, "Wait a second, there's a real and immediate danger now, and we have to come to the front." And so I think that I think that this question boils down to being able to discern when a danger is truly a danger and when a danger is really a bias. When a danger is a cultural bias, when a danger is down to views that we have that we should unpack and try to contextualize and try to be better about. be better people. And that will always and forever be a very fine line. And you'll always have argument about it. And you'll always have certain people calling others traitors for being more capacious and for having a lower sort of threshold of angst before danger. I mean, when Angela Merkel said, Germany is a strong nation, we can absorb all of these refugees from Syria. There were Germans who said, what are you talking about? This is going to be detrimental. And then there were others who said, way to go, Angela. That's the better side of humanity that we all want to strive towards.
So we've been talking a lot about altruism, which is one kind of evolutionary puzzle. You have just published a book that investigates another evolutionary puzzle, that of metamorphosis. Why is that an evolutionary puzzle? I guess it's surprising that if you want to build a butterfly, you don't start by building a butterfly. You start by building a caterpillar.
Yes. So yeah, and indeed, most of us think of tadpoles and frogs and caterpillars and butterflies when we think of metamorphosis, and it seems sort of quaint and almost like childlike. It's related to our childhood, and we think of it as kind of idiosyncratic and not very representative. But today, biologists estimate that 3/4 of all animal species undergo some form of metamorphosis, which is an extraordinary figure because it means that they need to go through, the definition of metamorphosis is radical or dramatic post-embryonic development. And it means that you need to go through that in order to become who you are.
And is that because they've hugely expanded the definition of what they mean by metamorphosis? Is that because there's way more sort of species of butterflies than we thought? Give us some examples of where there's a metamorphosis where we might not be thinking about it.
So take a starfish. A lot of marine invertebrates metamorphose. So a starfish starts out life as an egg, as all living things do. And then there's a developmental program that kicks in and begins to turn that egg into a juvenile, what we call a larva. And in the case of the starfish, the larva is really bilateral. In other words, it has the symmetry of you and me. It has a top, a bottom, a back, a front, and so forth. And it exists as a pelagic. It exists in the water. It kind of has wings. It looks like a little angel, a translucent angel. And then at a certain point in time, a second developmental program kicks in within its stomach and begins to create the adult, which has a different symmetry altogether. It's a radial symmetry. Doesn't have a back and a front and so forth, in the same way, a top and a bottom. And then what happens is that gradually it grows and grows to a certain size, and it migrates to the tips of its own juvenile, and then like a kind of immaculate conception, it falls down to the bottom and becomes sessile, and the adult and the juvenile exist simultaneously, and so the in some sense, the juvenile has birthed the adult. Each one of these creatures has the exact same genome in each one of its cells, but you would have no idea if you saw these two creatures together they have anything to do with one another. And in human terms, this is very strange. We almost don't have the language to describe this relationship because one is not the father of the other. They're not cousins. They're not brothers. They're an identity. But they're just different manifestations of the same identity.
It's amazing, by the way. I mean, Darwin is just incredible. I never really read The Origins of Species. And
you should, Yascha. It's a great
a few years ago, I downloaded an Audible. It happened to be offered for free or something, or perhaps I used the credit to buy it. I forget.
And so. So you have all these manifestations of metamorphosis in nature. There are different gradations of metamorphosis. So in insects, you really do have the creation of this chrysalis or a cocoon in the case of moths, where what emerges looks nothing whatsoever like what went in. And this is called true metamorphosis or complete metamorphosis. And there are gradations. There's sort of like, semi or metabolist creatures and so forth. But 3/4, that's a crazy number. And people have...
And so I guess
Yeah.
So I guess the obvious question is why, right? The obvious question is, I can see how there's an ecological niche for butterflies. If you want to create a butterfly, why go through the work of creating a completely different kind of creature and then have a butterfly evolve, grow out of that completely different kind of creature?
Right.
If you want to have this very, very simple kind of animal that lives in the sea and can barely do anything, why create a complicated animal first that then turns into this super simple animal? That seems like an incredible amount of wasted effort. And so is this a weird accident of evolution and how the biological program came about, or is there some genuine evolutionary fit that comes from these different kind of phases? And presumably that's the obvious question to ask about this.
So before we get to the solutions, there's just a really fascinating history when it comes to this conundrum. And it goes all the way back to the ancients, and people like Hippocrates and Aristotle and Pliny the Elder, they all weighed in. They lived in an ancient world that was suffused with miraculous transformations. And gradually the thinking about them, morphed itself into a science. So, people like Virgil, the Roman poet Virgil, counseled honeymakers to bury a bull with its horns above ground, just this amount, and then wait for 9 to 32 days, and then cut the horns. And that was the way to get bees, because bees would come flying out. And Pliny the Elder said that, that silk moth comes from vapor on rain-fallen oak blossoms. And other people counseled that women's hair, if it got hot enough, it could turn into snakes and so forth. So this was a preoccupation of the ancient world. Probably the most important influence was Aristotle, as with many things, who spoke of a causal universe in which things happen to creatures because it's in the nature of those creatures to become who they are. And in the case of Metamorphosis, what he wrote was that only the act of sex between a male and a female could provide a nature to a creature. Only a father who gives a creature its essence, its eidos, and a mother who gives its form. So the father was much more important because the essence is more important. The female was only the form. So insects, whom Aristotle thought were generated spontaneously, had to transform again in order to become who they are, because unlike us humans, they were born imperfect. And what's really interesting when you look at these ancient attempts to understand metamorphosis is that Aristotle saw butterflies and ants and all kinds of other insects having sex. But the theory was so much stronger than what he observed that
Interesting.
that it trumped what his eyes saw, and he stuck to his gun. So this is also...
This reminds me of a favorite piece of writing of mine by Tony Judd in The Memory Chalet, where he describes the graduate of the École Polytechnique in France who is sent to observe the first train between whatever it is, Manchester and Leeds, in the 1830s. And to report back about this worrying technological advance of the rival nation of the United Kingdom. And he goes and he observes everything perfectly, and he does some very detailed calculations as an engineer and reports back to the École Polytechnique that trains are scientifically impossible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, Aristotle insisted that women have fewer teeth in their mouths than men do, because of the way he thought of the difference between, and his culture thought of the difference between the essence of a woman and the essence of the man. And you want, from 2,500 years into the future,
essence of a woman was to be toothless.
Why don't you open your wife's mouth and just count the teeth and so forth?
Right.
But it doesn't work that way, because our ideas are always deeply enmeshed in the cultures that produce them. And so then, just to return to Metamorphosis, these ideas of the ancients were then Christianized in the Middle Ages by people like Aquinas and Albert, and Jews and Muslims like Ibn Khaldun and the Maimonides, who took them and they adopted them to their own. They adopted these views of transformation to their own communities, and yet, still, by the 17th century, we did not know how a man and a woman make a child, much less how a butterfly emerges from its chrysalis. And we didn't know.
What do you mean we didn't know how a man and a woman make a child? And surely by the 17th century,
we hadn't found
humans
an egg.
knew how.
No. This is an incredible history which I write about in the book. We did not know what the female egg was.
We knew about the act of sex, and we knew about the relation between the act of sex and getting pregnant, but we didn't know about the sort of anatomical or biological.
Men had sperm, but we were looking for the egg. What was it that the female brought? And Aristotle and Galen and others thought it was the menstrual blood. And then there were all these attempts to find, what was called a female testicle, and to find the egg. And until the 17th century, we really did not know how that works, and we didn't know whether it was the sperm or the egg which gives the creature its essence, or maybe just its form. We didn't also know whether all creatures existed like babushka dolls in miniature within their parents, going back to the Garden of Eden and to the origin of the world, as the Bible told. And it was a gradual, development of many discoveries made by a cast of quirky and egotistical gentlemen, and also a very extraordinary woman by the name of Maria Sibylla Merian, who's often called the mother of ecology, who traveled to Suriname when she was 52 years old to look at the life cycle of exotic tropical butterflies, and began to figure out just how living things are conceived and how they develop and how they reproduce, which are three terms which had all been bunched up together for millennia under what people call generation. And what's really fascinating about this story is that it turns out that cracking how metamorphosis worked was crucial for understanding these very fundamental questions about
how so. What's the connection?
It's a long and involved story, but I'd say the crux of it is that you had to understand that in Metamorphosis, as unlike what the ancients believe, this was not a phenomenon of spontaneous generation. That there was always an egg involved, and that all of life came from an egg. This was crucial for then other scientists not working on metamorphosis, but in some cases working on both, going out and searching out an egg in the uterus of females. So it's a really interesting connection between metamorphosis and just understanding how creatures are made. And also remember, there was no concept of a species, a stable species, in the same way that there was beginning with Darwin. And so really, people did believe, and this was the best science of their age, that anything could turn into anything. A human being could turn into a rabbit. These were beliefs that were in some cases published in the transactions of the Royal Society of London.
That helps to explain the long-standing obsession that people up to and including Isaac Newton had with alchemy. I mean, if humans can turn to rabbits, then surely something must be able to turn into gold.
Exactly, and these things are all related, and you have just these wonderful characters who, from our point of view, seem extremely, colorful, moving in between these worlds of inanimate objects and living creatures, and applying the same notions of transformation to both. And then in the 19th century, the question of metamorphosis really suddenly becomes a question about evolution, and why, to return to your question, why nature would go to such lengths to turn creatures into what they eventually become. Because if you think, there's a wonderful piece of writing by Orwell in which he observes a spadefoot toad from the Sonora Desert emerging from the ground after 10 months of sitting completely still, without eating, without moving. And he says this toad looks like a strict Anglo-Catholic towards the end of Lent. And its shrunken body allows one to see what you wouldn't see otherwise, that it really has the most beautiful eyes of any living creature on the planet. And he calls it a gold color, and I think it's called chrysoberyl, he writes, or something like that. But what Orwell neglected to tell his readers is that all of the drama had already happened, even before this frog emerged from its pond, because to become, to transform from a tadpole or into a frog that can live on land, it has to switch from breathing underwater to breathe on land. It has to exchange aquatic for terrestrial locomotion. It has to change its diet of plants and tiny water bugs to flies and crickets and earthworms. Its skin has to adapt to life above water, in other words, to the sun and to the winds and to rain. Gills have to become lungs. It has to grow a new cardiovascular system to carry hemoglobin, and a new immune system, because the dangers that lurk underwater are very different from the ones that prowl on land. And new color patterns have to invade its skin to make terrestrial camouflage possible. It has to recut its throat in sync with chest muscles to allow females and males to breathe above water, but also to call each other to mate. They need that for their mating practices. Front and back legs grow internally, and then they pop out spontaneously. The tail is absorbed. The gut is shortened. The heart arteries are newly retooled. The eyes are reformed into these gems that enchanted Orwell. And then, most amazingly, the brain. The brain is completely rewired and encased in a bony cranium. And so there's an enormous amount of massive destruction of tissues and organs and cell death and regeneration and genetic reprogramming and anatomical remodeling. And all this happens in a matter of weeks. And it's really a great question. And so scientists today, modern science, returns to this challenge, the double challenge. How does all of this happen? And why does it happen? And
do we have those answers? Are those answers clear? Are they tentative? What?
So in a general sense, if you think of metamorphosis as a mechanism to restrict intergenerational competition. So if you look like something when you're young, like one thing when you're young, and you eat a particular food, and you live in a particular area, and then you grow into something completely other, and you eat a different food, and you live in a different area, then you will restrict the competition between young and older, between juvenile and adult. So that's one general explanation for why metamorphosis evolved. But it's not.
I see. So the idea is that if a puppy dog and a grown dog nourish themselves from the same kind of thing, and so in an ecosystem where we don't have humans to give them to hunt bulls for them and give them bully sticks, they're going to be in competition with each other, and in competition with each other, the small dogs are going to lose out because they're less strong and possibly less agile, and so that creates a problem. And one way around that problem is to have the young animal before the metamorphosis search for very different kind of forms of nourishment. But presumably that assumes that the relevant level of analysis just is within the same species or within sort of a set of species that go through a similar kind of metamorphosis. If there is competition for that resource from other species that don't go through that kind of metamorphosis, those very simple creatures still have to search for the same kind of nourishment in competition with those other creatures. But for whatever reason, sort of avoiding that competition within the same species is sufficiently important that this still retains a big evolutionary advantage? Or isn't there sort of a further set of questions we have to answer there?
Yes, those are important questions. And what's amazing when you look at nature is its specificity. So a particular species will only eat a particular plant and nothing else. And it's evolved to specialize on this plant. And so, of course, the within species, an ability to sort of an ability to reduce competition within the species is crucial for that reason. But of course, nature is full of surprises and full of deceit. So you have a particular type of blue butterfly. It's called the blue butterfly, which is now actually under threat in Europe in many places. Which lays the egg turns into a little larva, which is a tiny little sort of auburn colored thing, and it drops from the tree onto the ground, and it emits a sort of chemical signal which attracts a very particular kind of species of ant, a myrmica, a kind of species of ant, and only that species of ant will react to this chemical signal, and it will come thinking that it has discovered its own, and it will lug it into its den and feed it at its own expense because it was deceived. And then some months later, once it had grown and grown and grown, the chrysalis will open up and a beautiful blue butterfly will have emerged. So, you have interspecies competition all the time and a great amount of deceit. But anything that will, give a species a certain edge will have a chance of being selected. So in a general sense, reducing that intergenerational competition is important. But then there's another sense, to explain in insects, because that's too general for explaining why in insects it's exactly the way it is. And there seems to be a trade-off between growth and differentiation. So you need to grow and grow and grow as much as you can to be strong and grow before you differentiate into the form that you will take, that will allow you to be a sexual reproducing creature. And so there are a lot of studies. I spent last year in a lab in the Freie University in Berlin with a team that's performing studies trying to understand the exact dynamics of this trade-off between growth and differentiation. So that's another explanation. Another explanation that's used is that you get rid of all of your gut biota when you destroy your gut and create a new one. And so it's an immunological explanation for metamorphosis. You basically change your gut residence because that'll make you stronger because you don't have resistance, which has been born. You start anew. You start afresh. So these are some of the explanations that have been given, and it's kind of interesting when you look at how we've imagined metamorphosis using three different orders, philosophy and God and science. The ancient Greeks looked at a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis as a kind of proof of a causal universe leading to us. So lowly insects and slimy frogs had to transform because they were imperfect, unlike us humans. And then medieval Christians looked at the very same phenomenon and they imagined it as a reflection of divine will. The transformation of a wriggly worm into a flying jewel is kind of an earthly reminder of the transfiguration of Jesus to Christ. So it says redemption is possible. And today we think of metamorphosis as a kind of scientific problem in genetics and physiology and as a road taken for reasons that we're still trying to discern on a blind evolutionary path. And we speak of genes and hormones in particular and molecular clocks. And we use amazing technology. So you can actually use a 3D microcomputed tomography camera to see exactly what's happening at every stage of metamorphosis within a chrysalis. And you can track each and every nerve cell that migrates and rewires to turn the brain of a caterpillar into the brain of a butterfly. And this is amazing. It's amazing, these are things that were unthinkable, clearly, just a generation ago.
There's a parallel to humans in a certain kind of way, and I was wondering about that. When we talk about altruism, we started off talking about, bees and queen bees and so on, but we ended up with an interesting set of reflections about how to think about whether humans are altruistic and
Exactly.
what the right mixture of altruism and egoism is in human cultures. How does all of this inform our reflections on humans? And I at
Right.
least have two questions, right? One is that obviously at the individual level, there is a paradox where you look at pictures of yourself as a baby and you think, that is me. I've been told that is me. I believe that is me. And yet it is a creature that is so different from what I am as an adult human being. To what extent, how should I think about personal identity in that way? And you
Right.
might sometimes think about it in terms of cultures, right? I mean,
Exactly.
Ireland 50 years ago was very monocultural, monoethnic, deeply Catholic, deeply religious, deeply pious. Today, it's an immigrant society, very secular, with very different kinds of political values. Clearly, Ireland is still Ireland, and clearly, Ireland is no longer Ireland, right? Clearly, I'm still myself, 42 years after being a baby, and clearly, I'm no longer that baby. And so, how do we think about that?
Right. So this is the problem of anything that grows, be it a human being or a culture. And it goes back to the story of the boat of Theseus, returning from Crete, and the Athenians retained the boat. They saved it. It was sort of the founding myth of Athens, and yet they replaced the planks each time when the planks were becoming eroded. And someone asked, Plutarch asked the question: Is this the same? Is this Theseus's boat? Even though not one of the planks is the same original plank. So. Metamorphosis is a wonderful test case for someone thinking about the relationship between culture, human culture, and nature, and our understanding of ourselves and our understanding of the world outside of us and of other living creatures. Because the biological definition of metamorphosis in a way is arbitrary. It's radical or dramatic post-embryonic development. So how radical does change have to be considered metamorphic? Who gets to decide? So we humans, we may not turn from caterpillars into butterflies, but most of us would agree that, you mentioned the cultural, we'll get to that in a moment, but as individuals, we undergo pretty dramatic post-embryonic development. And we have the U.S. Supreme Court on our side, the famous Miller v. Alabama case of 2012, which was based, among other things, on amicus curiae by the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, showing that young people's brains are wired differently than adults, and therefore should not be treated as the same legal category. So the highest court in the land decided that adolescent murderers couldn't be given life without parole. So clearly, creatures, they're said to be either metamorphic or not, but in reality, we all lay on a continuum. And it's really interesting at a biological level to see that the same hormones, thyroxine, for example, which determine the amount of connective glial cells in your brain versus actual neural cells, is the self-same hormone which clicks on metamorphosis in an ancient lamprey, 300 million years old. And which, analogs of which click on metamorphosis in a cockroach. So having evolved from an ancient progenitor, we too, in our own special way, we definitely metamorphose, and this seeps into our culture because we're very ambivalent about change. We cheer the flowering bud, but we mourn the rotting fruit. We search for our younger selves in mirrors while praising the wisdom that comes with wrinkles. Humans are very bad at living in the moment. We struggle to live in the moment, which is probably why in so many cultures we've imagined ourselves with metaphors like earth molded and remolded and flowing rivers and passing shadows and falling leaves. So there's a really interesting history of science to tell about metamorphosis. But there's also the human preoccupation with metamorphosis in art and music and literature and culture, in the works of Ovid and Kafka and G.M. Barrie, who's the author of Peter Pan, and in the music for strings of Richard Strauss. And what you see yet again when you look into this cultural history alongside the scientific history is that culture and science influence one another, that there really isn't such a thing as a pristine scientific method and code of conduct that somehow miraculously separates discoveries about the natural and physical worlds from the human worlds of the mind and the heart.
Right. The way we think about and conceptualize the world influences all of our science and vice versa as well. Is there a tendency, we are not a metamorphic species, right? We don't go through metamorphosis in the way that butterflies and so on do. Is there a tendency in our own minds to underestimate how much we change? I believe I saw a study once that was named something like the end of history illusion, which did a very simple thing. It looked, at 20-year-olds and got them to predict how much they would value a certain kind of concert ticket or a certain kind of consumer good 10 years from now. Yeah. And then it looked at 30-year-olds and it asked them how much they would value the same kind of thing as 10 years from their age when they would be 40.
Yeah.
And it found two things. The first was that young people change more than older people, that there is in fact more change that we undergo in our preferences between the age of 20 and the age of 30, or the age of 30 and the age of 40. But secondly, that at every age we vastly underestimate the amount of change that we're going to go through. But at 20, we think we're going to be pretty similar at 30, and we turn out to be very different. And at 30, we think we're going to be very similar at 40, and actually we end up being quite different at 40. So even though there becomes a little bit less change over time, we consistently underestimate how much change we're going to experience.
Yeah, I think that's true, and the studies bear that out. But there's also a different kind of studies which show that some people experience themselves as narrative. Their narrative about their own lives, and others are more episodic. So some people tell themselves a story. When I was born here and there, and then my parents sent me to this school, and then I went to the military, and then and they create their life story that way. And then there are others who really live much more in the present. They say about themselves that it's less crucial to the formation of their identity for them to tell stories about where they came from and where they went and where they're going and so forth. And there's a philosopher at Oxford called Galen Strawson who says of himself that he's quite episodic. He says, I don't have any narrative genes inside me. Now, if you look at him from the outside, from a bird's eye view, he is the son of Peter Strawson, who was, argued for free will and the reality of free will. Galen argues against the reality of free will.
Right, that's an amazing father-son pair where sort of
right.
The work of the father is radically undone by the work of the son in the systematic way. I mean,
right. So
it really is a form of philosophical patricide.
Right. He doesn't have any narrative, but this is in fact, a story that we tell ourselves, and for different people, different forms of memory, the importance of biographical memory. Play a different role in creating their identity. So for sure we have all of that. But in the end, we do science for practical reasons, like better medicines and weather forecasts and more efficient agriculture and electronics. And often we also tell ourselves that we do it because we're searching for truth, something we call truth. But we also engage in science in order to encounter metaphors that help explain life to us and explain ourselves to us. And as creatures that grow, as I said, the problem of that which grows, creatures that grow and adapt and remember. Metamorphosis is a puzzle that speaks to us in a very personal way. Because, sometimes we look at ourselves closely and we see ourselves disbanding, like a caterpillar in a chrysalis. And just as often we look at our past and we say, I was a different person then. But on most days, we do feel like ourselves, despite the fact that biologically we are constantly changing. And so it does mean something to us to learn that grown butterflies have memories from the time that they were caterpillars. which has been shown experimentally. And it does mean something that starfish can exist as two separate juvenile and adult selves. They don't have to give up, in a way, in our human terms. They don't have to give up on their juvenility to become adults. They stay juvenile. So really, what identity is a preoccupation which is perennial because it's a secret to us. And yet, each of us, whether we're doing science or we're making art or just waking up in the morning, will probably spend our lifetimes trying to figure it out. And that's why I love this theme of metamorphosis and turn to it to write about it.
Well, anybody who wants to learn even more about it should read your beautiful book, Oren Harman. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Yascha. Pleasure.